Mugabe is overthrown through the actions of his wife. Mugabe was brought low by his wife. Tony Blair and the European Union, the Americans, they all gang up. They were not able to defeat, but Mugabe was defeated by his wife. I found that the missing link was self-confidence. The colonial masters made the African lose his self-confidence. And anybody who loses his self-confidence, sometimes you cannot even get out of bed. My message is that we should stop being puppets of these major powers. We should be ourselves. Africans should be ourselves. We should fight for our common interest.
Welcome to another episode of the Runner Spirit podcast, where you follow my learning journey as I explore potential ways to empower African nations, address the legacy of colonization, and enhance the global respect for Black and African people. My name is Hamid, and as usual, we have Dr. Sumera Farha in the background, serving as my clarity coach. Sumera, can you say hi so everybody can hear you?
Hello.
Today, we are honored to welcome Baffour Ankomah, a distinguished journalist, author, and former editor of the New Africa magazine. For over 3 decades, Baffour has been a leading voice in African media, shaping narratives around continents, politics, culture, and history. His insightful analysis and advocacy for Pan-Africanism have not only challenged stereotypes, but also educated audiences worldwide about Africa's true potential. Beyond his journalistic work, Baffour is a passionate historian and thought leader dedicated to reclaiming Africa's narrative, and is also the editor of the book, The Africa Facts Book, Busting the Myths. So welcome to the podcast, Baffour.
Thank you for bringing
me on. It is a pleasure to have you. Let us begin with some of the work you've been doing lately. Before we started the podcast, you said you had a magazine that you wanted to show. Tell me about that and show it. What is it about?
My new baby is called The Third Eye. And if you screen can see the sort of headlines.
It says, "Don't believe the lie that you are a Bantu. You are not." What does that mean?
Western academia and historians have made the African believe that we are Bantus. And I find that this term was coined by a German young man who came to live in South Africa. I'm speaking to you now from Zimbabwe, even though I'm a Ghanaian.
Yes.
Western history does not allow the African to look beyond himself to see where our ancestry comes from. Our ancestry comes from ancient Egypt. And when our ancestors lost the empire, they migrated. People have counted about 6 major migrations. Some went to West Africa, some came down through the Congo forest and populated this part of the world, East Africa, Southern Africa. And as they were coming down, some Western historians are calling this movement from ancient Egypt because they were staying in one place for a long time and moved. The movement from the forest areas of Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, coming down, they term that as Bantus. And the Africans have believed that they are Bantus, instead of being descendants of the ancestor from ancient Egypt. That is why I did a study. We published this one, and we told them that they are not Bantus. Their ancestry come from ancient Egypt.
So it's called The Third Eye, and you're saying that everybody was originally coming from ancient Egypt.
Most Black people today, their ancestry come from ancient Egypt.
Interesting. So you're saying that most Black people today, their ancestry come from ancient Egypt, and they've migrated down to the western parts of Africa and so on, but then they stay in these places for a long time before the migration continues.
Yes.
They're then given this name Bantu. Isn't it true that there is differences in African people? Like there's genuine differences. You know, the way the West Africans look is very different from the way the Fulani look, or the Berbers, or the East Africans. And isn't that genetic differences? Doesn't that mean that they are different people?
We were from one stock, ancient Egypt and Nubia. And migration took thousands of years to come. Over time, people have changed, but sometimes even the languages. When I came to live in Zimbabwe from the UK, because my wife is a Zimbabwean and I am a Ghanaian, our language in Ghana is called Akan. The language in Zimbabwe is called Shona. And then I started hearing Akan words in Shona. Same pronunciation, same meanings. I was asking myself, how come between Zimbabwe and Ghana, you get a good 7,000 kilometers? How come the people of the Akans of Ghana share similar words with the same meanings with the Shonas? And if you trace it, you find that Our ancestors came from one source once upon a time. And then when we lost the empire and we migrated and the Akans went west and the Shoners came through the Congo forest down, we lost many things, but there are still some stubborn common words that are still in both languages. Our faces may look different, but the bloodline and the gene are quite solid from ancient Egypt.
Okay. I guess the hypothesis you're putting forward in this book is that ancient Egypt was the cradle, was where it started from
Yes.
before we moved down.
Yes.
Huh. So why do we believe that then? Why not Ethiopia or Morocco or anywhere else on the continent? Why do you think ancient Egypt was that main place that most of us started from and then migrated from?
Because studies have shown that's where we started. That's where the people migrated from. There are professors in the USA, in Britain. There is an interesting person. He's Ghanaian. His name is Ayikwe Ama.
Ayikwe Ama.
Yes, is one of the greatest writers Africa has had. He's written a lot of novels and books.
Is he still alive?
He's still alive. He lives in Senegal at the moment, where he set up a school for writers. But Ayikwe is the first African Egyptologist that I've seen who have taken time to go into the language of the ancient Egyptians, look at their literature. And he did his biography in 2006, which is called The Eloquence of the Scribes. And Ayikwe is talking about what he found in studying the ancient Egyptian literature. And he came across common Akan words, same meanings and same pronunciations like the ancient Egyptian language. So there is a continuum from ancient Egypt with these descendants of Black people in West Africa and Southern Africa, in East Africa, all across the continent. But the Africans, instead of researching and knowing where we come from, just believe people like this German young man, what is his name, who called them Bantus. The Africans believe that they are Bantus, but they are not.
Interesting. Oh, this is cool. So basically, there is a community of African Egyptologists now after Ayikwe, or is he still the only one looking at things from an African perspective?
I think he's the only one that I've known who has taken time to really study the ancestry of the modern Black African.
So this book, what's it called again? The Third Eye. This book, The Third Eye, did you write it or were you the editor of it?
It's not actually a book as such. It's a magazine, yeah. But here it's difficult to get the real magazine paper to print. So we use thick paper and it comes out like a book.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
But it's a magazine.
It's a magazine that we do every 2 months.
Okay.
And
So
I'm the editor of this one. Yeah.
Amazing. So this is you basically continuing your position as editor, because before this you were the editor of the New African magazine for years and years.
Yes,
you know,
which I have a copy here. If I roll up the camera, we did this issue. Did Columbus discover America? It says
Africans have been there before him.
Africans have been there before him. It's another major topic that Africans have not really looked at. Our ancestors from West Africa traveled to the Americas and did wonderful work that they immortalized them in huge statues, stone statues. This one here was found in Mexico. So the Africans should take time and look at their history.
Definitely. That's actually pretty interesting, because I think when I was working on Basic Nigerian History series, I came across something similar to that. Like, I think it was one of the Mansas of the Mali Empire.
Yes.
Just before Mansa Musa. I forget what his name was, but he was the one that decided to create, like, he spent his entire reign creating ships, and then he sailed with those ships west.
Yes.
But then we never heard back from him. So we don't know if he made it or if he didn't make it. But we are assuming that he made it, because there are evidence, such as the stone statues that you've mentioned, and that the evidence from those who were in the Americas that, oh, people have been here before.
Exactly.
Really interesting things. Samira, how are you feeling? Do you have any questions so far?
No, I'm quite impressed with the work that you've done so far, and the fact that this knowledge is out there for people actually focusing on the history of Black Africa, I think is really important, because as we know, in Western education, there is no insight into this, especially Columbus being the first to discover America, for example. Whereas,
Discover.
yeah, discover in quotation marks, by the way. Yeah, it definitely needs to be highlighted more.
There's something else I was going to ask you about your time at New Africa Magazine. How did you start at New Africa Magazine? Because it's owned by IC Publications, right?
Yeah.
And I looked into IC Publications and I saw that the owner was Tunisian. How did that happen?
I think it was called African Development at the time. It was set up by some white guys who were using it for business reporting. And then 1978, he bought it and divided it into African Business and New African. New African rode on until I joined New African in 1988.
1988?
Yes. After I had been chucked out of my country, I had to flee Ghana because I had earlier been arrested by the Jerry Rawlings military government. And they were going to arrest me again in 1985, 1986. So I left the country. I had to go through Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria. I was holed up in Nigeria for 11 months until finally I arrived in the UK in August 87.
Why was Jerry Rawlings' government trying to arrest you when you were in Ghana? Were you doing journalism there too as well?
Yes, I was the editor of a local newspaper called The Pioneer. The Pioneer was supposed to be the only existing newspaper that started in 1949. So I became editor of The Pioneer in 1983.
It's called The Pioneer, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. In 1987, you became the editor?
1983. 1985, 86, I had a scholarship to go to France to study international journalism. And while I was there, I did an article on Ghana. At the time, Jerry Rawlings was a leftist, and he was in bed with East Germany. And they wanted to turn Ghana into a socialist country on the format of the East Germany. I went to East Berlin one day, did an article, which I think at the time, youthful exuberance is a bad thing here. I did an article in which I said, if what I saw in East Berlin was they were trying to do in Ghana, then they will have to cut the heads of some of us in order to do it. It was quite a provocative piece, which was run in the Pioneer. And I didn't know. I was then studying in Paris, and the government, the East Germans, protested to the Rawlings, and they planned to arrest me on my return. So when I came back, there was an order to arrest me, but I was able to get out of the airport, went into hiding. I was in Ghana for 2 weeks or so hiding. And then I had to leave. And I left. And then it was a long route through Abidjan and then Lagos. And then I came to the UK. But in the meantime, I was a correspondent for New African Magazine. So,
in the meantime?
Yeah. While I was in limbo trying to get out of Africa, I was still corresponding for New African. So when I came to the UK, there was an opening for me to join. So I joined New African as assistant editor. And then 1985, I became deputy editor. 1999, I became editor. That's how I joined New African.
When you said you were a correspondent whilst you were trying to get out of Africa to the UK, what does that mean? Let's break that down into simple terms, because, you know, even for someone like me, I don't fully understand what you mean by being a correspondent. Does that mean you were just giving them information, or you were talking to them, or what does it mean to be a correspondent?
New African relied on freelance correspondence across Africa.
Freelance journalism?
Yes, freelance journalism. Most of our writers were freelance. There will be, like me, who was editor of The Pioneer, I would say be freelancing for New African on the side. So we have freelancers across the continent. And at the time, I was one of them, freelancing, writing articles for New African every month.
How did you get that freelance gig? Did you reach out to them, or did they reach out to you because you were the editor of The Pioneer?
I got to know the magazine from a friend who was a Nigerian. So he's the guy who introduced me to New African. And so they liked my writing. They liked the pieces I did. Yeah. When I was bogged down in Lagos for 11 months, they said, if you can come over to the UK, there's an opening for you. You can join us. I came over and there was an opening and I joined them. And I think I stayed from 1988 to 2014. I stayed a long time.
Wow.
Yes.
That's a long time.
All the time I was in the UK, I worked at one place at New African.
And when you were working at New African Magazine in the UK, you were exposed to a lot of things happening in Africa, because I think it was more or less your role to report on things that were happening on the continent. But I think you wanted to look at it from a more positive perspective, talk more about the positive side of things. Am I correct in saying that's how you were looking at things?
Yes, you are very correct. When I became editor of New African, I had studied the African condition, and I found that the missing link was self-confidence. The colonial masters made the African lose his self-confidence. And anybody who loses his self-confidence, sometimes you cannot even get out of bed. A human being, that drives you in your self-confidence. And the Europeans, my aim was to help the African regain its self-confidence. And how were we going to do it? We were going to look at the positive side of Africa. Yes, I knew that Africa had these problems, but we looked at Africa from the point of view where we said the glass is half full instead of half empty. So we said we are going to history. That's where my love for history came from. So look after real African history from ancient Egypt, from Nubia, from all these ones, to make the African know where he comes from. If you know your ancestry and you know that your ancestry was golden, you feel proud, and that can kick you, inspire you to do even more than your ancestors. So we looked at Africa from the glass half full instead of half empty.
So every time you write your piece on Africa during those moments in time, you would look at it from the lens of an half full glass. And then you would also, I guess, try to use history to bolster the reader's feelings, right?
Yes.
So your articles were like a mixture of history and what's happening in the modern day.
Exactly. And many times we use history to explain what's happening in the modern day. And under my editorship, we made the October issue for the Black History Month. So we consecrated the whole issue, the whole New African that October to African history. And we did it year after year after year. And it caught on. We had very good readership in Africa. When I took over the editorship, I think our monthly circulation was about 25,000. By the time I was leaving, we had had about 120,000 across the world, broadly from Japan all the way to Brazil, to North America, all the way to Europe. And New African at the time was a major force.
And then what were the key stories that you were pulling out? Because obviously you covered Africa for a long period. There were key things happening during that period. That was like almost 30 years. You said from 1980...
2014, yes. 28, 26, 28 months, maybe. 26.
Is that 20? That's more than 20 years, isn't it, Samira?
26, yeah.
Yeah, 26 years, almost 30 years. You were covering what was going on in Africa. I would love to hear some of the most interesting stories or the most interesting things that you actually covered, or something that you covered that was really resonated with you, that you remember till today.
I think I can name two things. The first one was the coverage on Zimbabwe.
Which is where you're living today, right?
Which is where I'm living today. There is this front cover we did, if you can see.
The land they won't share.
Yes. And this is about when Zimbabwe decided to take back their land from the white settlers. It was a major issue where Tony Blair and George W. Bush ganged up and tried to effect a regime change in Zimbabwe under President Mugabe. And I was then in the UK. And Zimbabwe became a major issue for New African, and for me personally, where in the UK, Sky News, BBC, and all those radio stations, if anybody wanted an alternative view of Zimbabwe, it was me they called to the studio. And even at conferences in Europe, I would go there and speak about Zimbabwe, because there was a lot of falsehood that the Western media dish out there, trying to tarnish the image of Zimbabwe and its president at the time, Mugabe. So I worked very much on Zimbabwe. Before that, I had also worked on Liberia when there was civil war in Liberia, from 1992 all the way to 2002. And I covered Charles Taylor, the then president of Zimbabwe, that the Americans wanted out of power.
Oh, you mean the president of Liberia?
Yes, again, regime change. And the Americans largely succeeded in getting the special court for Sierra Leone that they moved from Freetown in Sierra Leone to The Hague to put Charles Taylor in for 50 years. As I'm speaking to you, Charles Taylor is in the prison in, is it Newcastle upon Tyne or somewhere? In Britain. 50 years in jail.
So Charles Taylor, the ex-president of Liberia, is currently in prison in Newcastle.
Yes. It was one of the major miscarriage of justices you can get anywhere, because America wanted him in jail.
Why did they want Charles Taylor out of power? What was he doing that was irritating them or was like causing an issue for them?
Charles Taylor was a CIA asset before he became president. CIA,
Really?
yes. I interviewed Charles Taylor over 7 times, and even in court, he himself said as much. Was a CIA asset, and the Americans released him from jail in Boston to come and start a war to overthrow the then president of Liberia, who was called Samuel Doe. Doe had been helped to be in power. The America gave him money, weapons, everything. But at some point, Doe lost favor with the Americans and they wanted him out. So they brought Charles Taylor from jail to start this war against Doe. Somehow, in the middle, Charles Taylor parted ways with the Americans, not amicably. The Americans, if you lie in bed, they should tell you when you get out of bed. If you get out of bed by yourself, they are not happy. So they plan to get Charles Taylor out from 1989, actually, all the way to 2003, when they got Charles Taylor out of power through this court. And in the court, the Americans put the levers behind the court, and the judges, instead of going by the evidence before them, used political intrigue and got Charles Taylor 50 years in jail. 50, my brother.
50, 50.
Yes.
He's still alive till today, isn't he?
He's still alive, but I wonder if he can serve the term and come out alive. Because when they put him in, he was 64 years old. If you plus 50, will make him 104.
Yeah. And they tried him where, according to this
in The Hague.
Politician? They tried him in The Hague. They said he was a war criminal.
Yes.
Man, this is just very typical of the Americans. Yeah, so they say Charles Taylor is a war criminal, but Netanyahu is okay by
Netanyahu is okay. Netanyahu is okay. How many people has he killed over 1 year? Netanyahu is okay. Today I was watching him at the UN being so arrogant. Putin cannot go anywhere. Netanyahu can go and address the world at the UN. Putin cannot go anywhere.
I'm guessing the reason why this particular event, along with the Zimbabwe one, stood out to you is because you felt like, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Actually, maybe you explain to me why these two events are the ones that stood out to you from your career of journalism in Africa over 26 years and more.
Personally, I have the philosophy. My personal philosophy has always been, as a journalist, to look on the other side of the world, to see what is there. I never took anything from face value. Still, I saw that the Americans were behind all the troubles that were going on. They actually formed some rebel groups, even after Charles Taylor had won democratic elections in 1997, free and fair. The Americans started training 4 rebel groups in the forest in Guinea to overthrow Charles Taylor. So I started myself to look at the other side of the war to see what was happening. So my reporting was very counter to the general news coming out of Liberia from the Western media. Again, in Zimbabwe, exactly the same thing happened. The Western media, because the white people who had stolen the land in Zimbabwe from the blacks, from the ancestors of the blacks, Mugabe and his people are now saying, give us some. And if we are not going to give, we will take it willy-nilly. So as soon as this program started in 2000, the white media, the Western media, drew a line in the sand and said, we are going to support the white farmers. So as a black person who was living in the UK at the time, I decided that, okay, I'll look at the other side of the war. What was the truth? And we found that the black people of Zimbabwe were right in taking back the land. So I threw my whole spirit behind these black people who were taking back their land.
Incredible. But did you feel like you were just one person shouting into the storm? Because the white media is so massive, like with what America being able to just take down Charles Taylor, put him in jail. I'm reading on Wikipedia right now about the things he did that he was tried for. And I don't see genocide. I don't see him killing masses of people, according to Wikipedia. Maybe I'm mistaken. They said war crimes, but I don't really see it here compared to the stuff that we're seeing today with our eyes from Israel.
The Americans started, the prosecutors all came from America. Yeah. They started with 27-point indictment. And it was so comical that they had to shut it down to 21 and to 11. Yeah, three. So from 27 to 21 to 11 points indictment.
Why did they reduce it then? Because it didn't make any sense?
It didn't make any sense at all. America just wanted to lump everything on him to get him in jail. So the 11 points, they found him not guilty on all the major points. They found him guilty on a minor point of aiding and abetting.
Did he aid and abet?
He helped them with some weapons and things like that. Aiding and abetting got him 50 years in jail. You can see on Wikipedia that there was nothing they could hold him onto, but the Americans wanted him in jail. And it's 750 years there.
That's the thing. We see these double standards existing throughout history and currently too. If they have a goal, even if it doesn't make sense intellectually, they will find a way. What I was wondering, a bit like what Hamid was saying, I wanted to follow up on the fact that Western media is so dominant. Everybody gets their news from the West. And you're this alternative voice and alternative narrative. What inspired you to, one, maintain that alternative voice, but to even start? Was this something from a very young age, or is this something that you thought post you having to flee Ghana that you wanted to do?
Yeah, I think you're right. You take me to my young days. Now, I have a bald head. When I was young, my first name was called Francis Ankomah. And it bothered me so much as I was going through school. I kept asking myself, have I ever seen a white man called Kwame? In Ghana, we have Kwame, Kofi, like Kofi Annan. Why was I Francis? Before I entered the School of Journalism, I changed my name. I dropped Francis and I chose Baffour. Baffour is the title for warrior kings in Ashanti. And I told myself, I'm going to be a warrior with a pen. I'm going to use my pen to fight the causes of Africa. From a very early age, these days, I look back and I said, wow, I was quite radical then. So I changed my name and went to tell my dad and said, I'm not more Francis. My father was a catechist in the Catholic Church and he never liked it. He didn't like it. But I chose Baffour pointedly to be a guide. And so as I grew up and became more enlightened, fighting causes for Africa became a second nature to me. That would be the answer. From a very young age, I saw myself as a warrior. Using my pen. And when Zimbabwe issue came out, yes, New African became a lone voice. And I became a lone voice. And I pushed it to a point where the Western world nearly killed New African. We are based in the UK, like New African, which is a Pan-African. Our major sources of advertising were white companies, multinationals, who had businesses in Africa. But when the Zimbabwe issue came, and then New African latched onto it as a major issue, all of them withdrew their advertising.
Oh, wow.
It started with Mercedes-Benz, who said, we don't want to advertise in a magazine that supports violence in Zimbabwe. But it was not violence. These are African people whose land have been stolen by a few white people, and they wanted their land back. So they took their land back. It started with Mercedes-Benz, then Japanese car makers all withdrew, DHL withdrew, all of them withdrew, to a point that in 2005, I remember, and I always say that was the lowest point in my journalism career. The proprietor of New African called me to his office one day and asked me, Baffour, this Zimbabwe thing you are doing, what is it in it for us as a company and for you? And Hamid, I had no answer. I had not thought about it. The New African was now publishing with almost no adverts at all. And we were suffering. For the first time, we could not even pay our correspondents. So I didn't have any answer for him. I looked at him blankly. And then in the end, we agreed that we have to tone down on the Zimbabwean coverage.
Wow. So it just goes to show the backlash you experienced and how they kind of cornered you in a way to try to silence you or censor you to a certain degree.
Exactly.
But just like you said with your name, you continued to resist up until today, where you're doing the work that you do.
Yes, and I'm continuing with the third eye here. We are doing some wonderful historical pieces. This started 2 years ago by the president of Zimbabwe, who said, Pan-Africanism is dying. Let's get a magazine and start talking about Pan-African issues. Yeah. So we started it here in Zimbabwe. It's now going into universities in South Africa trying to circulate in the certain African region. We want it to be another African within a year, so that we can send copies to the UK for people to see what we are doing down here.
Amazing.
Yeah.
No, that would be lovely. That would be lovely, definitely.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of people interested in reclaiming or just getting more knowledge on sort of their heritage. And I think we need to shout about these things so that
Yes.
more people have access to it. And hopefully this is one of the ways. Right, Hamid?
I agree, because I'm thinking about the fact that these companies had to basically start withdrawing their support for New Africa just because you were supporting the Black people of Zimbabwe and their rights to their own land. And you were just a magazine. You weren't even like a YouTube channel. You weren't massive. You were big and you had influence in certain areas, but you weren't like Sky News or BBC News.
No, we're not, yes.
You weren't that big yet. It still affected you. I would have thought they would be like, oh, New Africa isn't that big. We don't need to penalize them. But no, it seems they're penalizing regardless. And it reminds me of what happened recently to African Stream. So there's a media platform on social media called African Stream, banned from all social media platforms by the US. And they're not even that big. They weren't crazy. They didn't have millions and millions of followers. They were just starting to rise up and they were shut down. It seems like history repeats itself over and over again.
Yeah, and I think they shut you down before you even get big. That's the tactic. So even though on one hand, Hamid, it's like, oh, well, they're not as big as other popular media platforms. I think that's it, catching it when it's growing to stop it from flourishing.
Yeah. You also remember in the 2000s, we didn't have social media as it is today. And 24-hour news, yes, was there. But at the time, there was a hole for New African to be effective and impactful because most Africans will wait for a month, their copy of New African. And as I go around, like yesterday, I saw some guy, his house, he has New African parked there. He will read and pass on, and they'll read and pass on. In that sense, it was effective, and the Americans will not want a thing like that. Interestingly, I meet people here, and they wonder why the British did not move any hand to say, arrest me or do anything to ban New African. And I said, maybe it's because the British were showing that they are really democratic, because we're right in the belly of the world. Our office is in Colbert Square, which is off a Farringdon Road here. We're right in the middle of central London. And they did not raise any hand to try to stop us from reporting the counter view. I remember there was only one time where Tony Blair was then Prime Minister. We were trying to interview him for one issue of New African. He agreed to write a piece. We know somebody was going to go sit for him. In the end, he said no. The interview, he changed to a piece, which I think somebody might have ghosted it for him. So we ran the piece in the New African issue. It came out that very week when it came out. Tony Blair was going on a West African tour, and he carried along with him all the other African media based in the UK, apart from us at New African.
Why?
I never understood it, because we asked him to write a piece, and he wrote about his African policy, wrote about Zimbabwe, wrote about West Africa. And he was going on a West African tour, Ghana, Sierra Leone. He carried the other African journalists with him on his plane. Never asked, we're not invited.
Is it because you guys were the only ones supporting the Zimbabweans for the right to their own land?
Yes. There was no African magazine at the time in the UK doing what we did.
Interesting.
We were mad about Zimbabwe.
Yeah. You guys were like, you were on it. You guys were like, no, we're not leaving this topic. We're going to support our people. I like that, though. I like that.
Yeah.
It's like resistance. Yes. Resisting the opposition, the oppression, the David versus Goliath.
We had to support David. David did not have that stone. Same compared to the European Union, all of the West. I call them the nations of European stock. So you have the Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, all team up against a small country like Zimbabwe.
So crazy. And obviously you paid the price for it, like you said, with companies, corporations in the West withdrawing their funding from New Africa. That I'm sure that hit the organization financially, like you mentioned, and like that was difficult. What can we learn from all these three things we've talked about? The Charles Taylor scenario, how America was just able to do whatever they wanted there. The thing in Zimbabwe and how the Western corporations more or less blocked your financial funding. What can we learn from this? Are there any wisdoms that we can take away that you've learned that we can apply to today? Because we are still facing the same problems. Same thing with Palestine that is happening right now. If anybody speaks up about Palestine, the way it affects you is pretty bad. And Sudan and Congo aren't even being mentioned in the Western
Yes.
media. So are there any wisdoms or thoughts that you've experienced from your past that we can apply to today?
Yeah, the first one, obviously, Zimbabwe and how they were not able to defeat Mugabe. They were not able to defeat Mugabe because there was unity in Zimbabwe largely, even though they formed an opposition party, Morgan Tsvangirai's party, to try to use that to overthrow Mugabe. But in Zimbabwe, they were not able to overthrow Mugabe. Let's put it this way. Zimbabwe is maybe the most educated country in Africa. Maybe if you take the North Africans out of the equation. They have a cadre of educated Zimbabweans who understood what was happening here. And they were able to support their government to further regime change agenda. I wrote about it. I look broadly before independence or before colonialism and during and after. Any African leader could be traditional leader, a king or president. Any leader the West decided to overthrow them, they were able to overthrow, apart from Mugabe. So it became something quite hard for me to take when Mugabe is overthrown through the actions of his wife. Mugabe was brought low by his wife. Tony Blair and the European Union, the Americans, they all gang up. They were not able to defeat, but Mugabe was defeated by his wife.
What do you mean by that?
In the end, the woman went crazy. She wanted to be president. She did things here that upset the traditional power bloc. So Mugabe was overthrown through that kind of thing. But the wisdom I want to put across. I look at my own country, Ghana. We had our first president, Kwame Nkrumah, who was very good for us. But Nkrumah, when the Americans and the British decided to overthrow him, it took only 2 years. I have studied the Nkrumah phenomenon. The British and the Americans started this coup that overthrew Nkrumah from the 2nd of February 1964, when the then British Prime Minister, Douglas Home, flew to the White House to go and meet President Lyndon Johnson. They teamed up and they decided that Nkrumah must go. 2 years, Nkrumah was gone. Mugabe, they started on him from 2000 all the way to 2017. They couldn't because at the time in Ghana, Nkrumah did not have the intellectual backup that Mugabe had. So that is one wisdom. The second wisdom is the Chancellor thing. Chancellor hobnobbed with the Americans. And then at some point, he decided to jump out. The Americans decided that, no, we can't let you go. And because of hobnobbing with the Americans, he allowed himself to become vulnerable to American propaganda, American everything. It was easy for the Americans to put him in jail. Africans must learn, if you want to be a puppet, prepare to have your bitter end. My message is that we should stop being puppets of these major powers. We should be ourselves. Africans should be ourselves. We should fight for our common interests. Do what is good for the interests of our people. For our own selfish, short-term interests, you go and lie in bed with the Americans and short him where power lay, Chastila.
Yeah, essentially, if you want to build as people in Africa, is not to necessarily associate yourself or get support from the West or from people who can, in the end, overthrow you in some kind of way or the other.
Yeah, should not be a puppet of these big powers because then you become vulnerable. That's what happened to Charles Taylor.
This is really important, isn't it, Hamid, as an entrepreneur yourself, in terms of where you get your investments, how can you ethically build a business, and how can you maintain your ethos, whether it's being a Pan-African or any kind of values, when you have maybe people who are not aligned. So I think that's really important. I think sometimes when people want to build, they desperately need investment from people with power that don't necessarily have their best interests long term. Yeah. But how do we do it then? I guess that's the question. Are Black individuals building and helping other Black individuals to thrive? What's going on? What's the gap?
In America, they have more of an understanding of that community of Black individuals helping others to build and providing capital. I'm not so sure about Africa. So, Baffour, you can enlighten us around Africa. If we want to build without relying on the people in power, the powers of who that will eventually oppress you, and you want to build with your own people, are you likely to get support from Africans, capital, that type of thing? Because, for example, New Africa, the third eye, is something you want to do. You want it to be the next New Africa, but this time you don't want to rely on funding from Western corporations that can remove their funding if you start saying anything that goes against what they want.
The point I'm making is not to have relations with Western powers. No, the point I'm making is that don't be a puppet. Don't be a puppet against your own people. Yeah, no, because we are in a global village. We need investment from all over the place to be able to do. If you look at East Asia, the targets became targets because of Western investment. We cannot do without Western investment. But the point I'm making is that don't make yourself a puppet for Western investment. If you want to do business, do genuine business. Like over here, we had in Zimbabwe, we had a politician who was called Morgan Tsvangirai.
Okay.
He was the opposition leader who was puffed up by the West. They wanted to use him to overthrow Mugabe and rule Zimbabwe and look after Western interests. Morgan Tsvangirai never became president because of being a puppet. If Tsvangirai had made himself or carried himself as an indigenous politician who wants to fight for indigenous interests, he would have become a president. But Tsvangirai made himself such a puppet that it was quite tiring even to report on his activities. That is what Charles Taylor started to do. He allowed the Americans to use him. And then in the end, he wanted to break away from them when he saw that, no, I can't do what the Americans want me to do now. The Americans said, no, if you can't, then we'll push you out of power. And when he had even won democratic elections, they used the UN to impose economic sanctions on Liberia. And Liberia is a country of trees. Liberia has always been in the American orbit since 1847 when it became independent. So when you have sanctions and the Americans put their grip on you, you can't do anything. Just still made himself too vulnerable.
Okay, the wisdom we've learned is that we can do business with the West, but just don't become a puppet if you want to achieve things. I'm just trying to see what we can take from that and like how we can be better, what knowledge and wisdom we can take from each person's failure and be like, let's not do the same, let's not make the same mistake going forward.
Yes.
With the Mugabe situation, America failed mainly because of the education of the people. I think that was a key point that you mentioned.
Yes, education and the support. So they were able to support the Mugabe and the interests of the nation of Black people. Yeah, that was quite essential.
Who supported the interests of the Black people?
Mugabe was fighting for the interests of Black people. And he had massive support from his people who knew, who were aware, who were conscious of the struggle in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
If you contrast that with Ghana, Nkrumah was there for 1957. It was Nkrumah who brought mass education to Ghana. So Nkrumah was in power for only 9 years. And many Ghanaians had not risen, had not had education enough for them to be conscious of the struggle that Nkrumah was fighting. So it was easy for the Americans to use the people to overthrow him. They used the police and the army to overthrow him.
Education is important. Do not be a puppet of the West. I think that's easier said than done, obviously, from my perspective, if I look at it, because they have so much power. And then in your situation where you guys were in New Africa, you were trying to support David against Goliath, and all your income was coming from the West. Can we learn from that going forwards? Maybe diversify your income a bit. If you're doing a media, if you know you're going to be fighting against the powers that be, is there a way to diversify your income so that you're not relying on just one source? Maybe that would have helped, do you think?
Yes, that would have helped. But being an African publication, you also rely on some special reports from Africa. But time came when the Africans were not advertising, doing special reports. So even if you wanted to diversify your income, you have the global multinationals that doing business in Africa would want to advertise in the magazine. and you have the African companies and governments that will support you. So if you don't get much from the African side, there is only one source, which is the Western and global advertisers. They gang up against you, you are dead.
Yeah. What about the East, China? I've been seeing lately in the news and just in general, the relationship China is building with multiple African nations, including Zimbabwe, actually. I think I read somewhere Zimbabwe is a major producer of lithium, which is very important for batteries, cars, and everything. And China has now pledged to support the industrial upgrades in lithium. So it seems there is more than one empire or power in the world now. So would it be sensible to say if something like New Africa existed today, or African Stream or something like that, and they were getting money from advertisements from the West, but then they also had money from Africa for some special publications, like you said, and then maybe they had advertisements from China as well coming in. So that way, at least if the African thing dried up and then the West gangs up on you, at least maybe you still have the third opposition, the third avenue of revenue.
Yeah, you're right. But 24 years ago, China was not so dominant in Africa like today.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. I'm just talking about what we can take from what's happened with you and how we can be better going forwards.
Today, there is that option. The Chinese option is there. But during our time, it wasn't so prominent. And I will cite the example of even Zimbabwe Mugabe, when the West ganged up against him and placed economic sanctions on them. He looked east. There was what he called the Look East policy, and he was now doing more business with the Chinese, with the Eastern Bloc, and that also helped him to be able to stay the fight against the West. So yes, now, like when you're talking about the lithium in Zimbabwe, the lithium mining is done by Chinese companies. So today, there is an option to look east.
How do you feel about China now coming? Because I'm realizing that they're in a lot of places in Africa and it's becoming big. And I don't know, I'm a bit worried because experience has shown me that our African leaders are not the best at striking deals. And it might look, everything is going well now. The Chinese are building roads, they're building infrastructures. But I keep worrying that what are we giving up for this? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it looks like a catch-22 situation here. If you go back to the West, African relationship was only one way. During colonial days, you are only allowed to look up to the mother country. So after independence, African relations were all coming to Europe. But you ask yourself, during that era where there was no China, what did the West actually do for Africa? You are talking about building roads and infrastructure. China is at least building roads and some infrastructure. So we can let them eat a bit and we get our roads done, we get our infrastructure done. Our leaders, quite important, should be able to learn how to cut the deals. Yeah, sometimes they are not able to cut these deals even with the Chinese. But half a loaf is better than no bread. I mean, we allowed the Chinese to eat half of the bread. We have half of the bread ourselves. Yeah, that is my view about it. Because when we were in New African, we were being urged to kick against the Chinese here, to be reporting like, oh, China is going to take over Africa. We decided that we are not going to go that way because we saw how the West had treated Africa over years. And the Chinese are coming. So it's better to have two options. That now there is an East and there's a West. We can now...
There's a marketplace.
Exactly. Decide which market is ideal for us.
I think what you said about our leaders knowing how to cut deals is very important because I'm just worried because based on our history with the West and some of the deals that have been cut, like the way we just give things up, we might give up oil reserves for like 20 years for like 2 million. And that thing is actually worth like, I don't know, billions and billions of dollars. And I'm just like, what the hell? Who made this deal? What leader? What was he thinking? I'm hoping that kind of mentality is still not around, basically, because obviously the Chinese will take advantage of it if it's still floating about.
Yeah. That actually reminds me about something, again, which are still in Liberia. When he was arrested, before then, Halliburton, this American giant, was dying to come and exploit oil in Liberia. Yeah. And they were offering Liberia 1 cent in every dollar. And Chastela kept shaking his head and said, no, I can't do that. When he was arrested, before the trial, Halliburton sent his officers to come to see Chastela and said, look, if you agree to this deal, we will be able to impress on our government so that the trial will not come on. Chancellor looked on and said, no, I can't let you come and exploit the oil in Liberia for a song. Then Chancellor said in court, then the elevating guy said to him, then Mr. President, we can't help you. And so the trial has to start.
So they were using the trial to try to get more access to their oil reserves.
Exactly. And they were going to give Liberia 1%. Yeah.
1 cent for every 99. For
1 cent
dollar.
for every dollar. Yeah. I
So
said
they're
no.
going to give Liberia % of their own oil reserves.
Yes. And that's how most African oil producers are getting it. Gambia also have oil. They wanted to come and exploit under President Yahya Jammeh. Jammeh had looked broadly at what other African countries were getting. So it was an American company that wanted to give them Gambia 5%. And the guy said, no, I will not agree to 5%. And they kept pushing him. And he told us, New African, in an interview, that the last time he told the American that if you ever step your feet on the soil of Gambia, I'm going to put you in jail. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing we are getting, 5%. And these guys have 95% for 30 years.
Wow. 30 years.
Yes.
See, this is the type of deals I don't want us to be making with the Chinese. We should have learned our lessons from the West, and now wish we were making better deals with the Chinese. But like, how can we ensure our leaders are making better deals? Now we have social media. Now we have all these things. If a deal was made and it's stupid, shouldn't we be able to just publicize this and be like, look how dumb this president was. Look at the deal he made. Is there a way we can hold them to account in some ways?
We can hold them to account if we know the details of the deals here. But most of the time, we don't know. Like in my own country.
Is it our legal rights to know the details of the deal?
Yes. What do they call them? Freedom of Information Act. Maybe you could get. But most of the time in Africa, they keep the deal at the presidency. So you never get to know it. But if we know it, then we can start activism around it.
So if there was Freedom of Information Act, then we can get access to this type of information. We can find out the deals people are making. And if someone makes a stupid deal, we can make fun of them online, at least.
Yes.
But in order for that to happen, we need to either get Freedom of Information Act, or we need to find a way to know the details of that deal.
Yes.
You think we can know from the other side? Because usually they make these deals with other people. So if they're making deals with the West, making deals with Chinese, do you think we can get to know from the Chinese side?
That is even more difficult to know. Yeah.
Oh, God.
Why would they showcase that when it's in their advantage? Like the Chinese or the East, they're not going to tell you this is the deal we're making and we're getting a bargain.
They're cheating more or less.
Yeah, I don't know in terms of legislation, laws, etc. That the Freedom Information Act actually exists in Africa.
In some African countries, we have, but even that is difficult to get information.
Yeah.
On things like this, they might tell you it's classified. I was going to say it's difficult to get information out of African governments.
Everything is digital now, right? And these deals that people are making, there's a digital record somewhere, usually, isn't there?
Yes, you need somebody to whistleblow.
You need someone to whistleblow.
Unless you want to hack into the government systems, you will not know, even though it's digital.
Yeah, unless someone or a group of people who are very well versed in the law can also just create some kind of petition that whatever deals are made in countries, there needs to be some level of the people involved. Yeah, that in itself would be something long term, right?
Yes.
Like it won't happen overnight. When people want to change the laws and the systems, it's not going to happen overnight. I don't even know if there's people looking into this already.
You know, in the UK, they have the 30-year rule where documents will come out. In Africa, I haven't ever seen anywhere in Africa that we get documents coming out after 30 years.
There was a very intellectual tech genius, or maybe a group of tech anonymous communities, and their role was to hack to get these deals and publicize these deals online. That could be another way. Not saying that should happen, but I'm just saying that could be another way.
Yes. That could be another way.
I was going to say there should be an ethical way to do it. If
possible. Sure. There should be ethical way, but then there should be fast ways too.
It's true, whistleblowing, right?
I was going to say that would be an illegal way of getting it, and when you are found out, they will come and get you.
Yeah. Exactly. There's always repercussions, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
for those people that do such things.
Yeah, for those people. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Cool.
Just clarifying.
Yeah, it's definitely for those people. Did you have any other questions, Samira, that you wanted to ask Baffour?
No, if anything, this just highlights a lot of the systemic issues, like worldwide, but in Africa, we've just highlighted how do the local residents, how can their influence change, and some of the limitations to that. And you made a really good point, Hamid, about the East really influencing. Because when I lived in Mozambique, I saw the influence of China in Mozambique whilst I was there in my 20s. And if anything is increasing, I think Turkey too, to a certain degree. I saw the influence of Turkey in Mozambique. So it is interesting because depending on the leadership, that really influences the country, right? And what is invested in the country. And if you don't know what deals are being made, how do you protect yourself?
How do you hold people to account?
Exactly.
I just don't get it. If we don't know what deals the leaders are striking, how are we going to hold them to account? How do we make sure it's in the benefit of the people? I don't know. Buffer, maybe you can help us out.
I think it's really big, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's a big dilemma.
Difficult to get the details of these deals.
Yeah,
They
something
hold
has to
their
change.
chest at the presidency. All that we see that the Chinese companies are mining here, yeah. Mozambique, Zimbabwe, the Chinese are big here in the mines.
I see.
Remember, the Americans have still not removed all the economic sanctions they put on Zimbabwe. The Chinese, the Eastern countries have taken advantage of that economic sanctions. While the Americans are blocking their companies from coming in, the Chinese have taken over. They have also helped in Zimbabwe in many ways with infrastructure projects, things like that. So sometimes Americans will impose sanctions. It's like cutting their nose to spite their face. A typical example is in South Sudan. Before you go, Hamid, South Sudan, the war that started after independence. Again, you have American dirty hands in it.
I remember when I finished uni, around that time was when South Sudan started becoming like this freshly independent country. And I was so
Yeah,
excited for it.
2011, yep, yes.
I was like, yo, this is going to be, finally, these people are going to get it right because obviously they've seen the mistakes everybody else has made. So they're going to do something amazing. And then,
Yes.
boom, it wasn't. Why was the US involved? How were they involved?
I've interviewed the president of South Sudan twice, 2014, 2016, and he repeated it. We ran it big in New African here. What happened was that before South Sudan independence, we had Big Sudan, and South Sudan was part of Big Sudan. And the oil in Sudan, most of it is in the south. And the Americans were angry at the president of Sudan because Osama bin Laden was once based there. So they imposed sanctions on Sudan. So when South Sudan was becoming independent, negotiating, President Salva Kiir, who is the now president of South Sudan, told me that at the time it was ExxonMobil, the American company, that was prospecting for oil in South Sudan. And because the American government did not had an issue with the president of Sudan, Khartoum, they told ExxonMobil to quit. ExxonMobil quit and allow the Chinese to come in. The president told me that the blocks where Exxon was prospecting was empty. The blocks where ExxonMobil was doing. At the time, South Sudan was not independent yet. So America had to go through Khartoum. And they said, no, we wait. After independence, we know what to do. So the Americans did not come. And South Sudan, the Chinese and the Malaysians come in and occupy the place. So after independence, there was no more room for the Americans. And they did not like that. So to get their way in, they wanted Salva Kiir to be overthrown. So the Americans cut deals with the vice president here. So 2013, the war broke out. And they were supporting him. So I went to South Sudan, interviewed the president. He told me, I came back to London, reported it big in New African. I went again in 2016 to report. And he repeated the same thing. The Americans have never, ever denied or confirmed it.
So basically, the US was supporting the opposition in that civil war just so they can get access to the oil reserves that were in South Sudan.
Yes, that's what the president told me.
And previously, the people who had access to those oil reserves were the Chinese and the Malaysians, you said?
No, previously it was the Americans. So when they pull out, Exxon pull out, and ExxonMobil, Sudan had to find another investors. And the Chinese came and occupied the place, and the Malaysians.
Yeah. So the Chinese and the Malaysians occupied the gap that America left, but because they weren't backing they decided we're going to just spark a civil war to get back in.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
That is why the South Sudan war never ends here. They will be quiet, and then it flares up again, quiet, and flares up again.
Do you know what's happening in Sudan, actually?
I haven't followed the current events in Sudan, this war between the armies, which I find quite amazing here. How they have continued to kill and destroy the country like that.
Do you know if it's affecting South Sudan as well?
There have been refugees that have come from north to south since years. But apart from that, politically, the South is trying to mind its own business. And amazingly, South Sudan too was left undeveloped by the British and the Egyptians who ruled in Sudan at the time. And then after Sudan independence, the South was kept very backward, to the point that I remember when I went there in 2016, the only piece of tarred road in South Sudan, huge country like that, covered 120 miles from Juba to the Uganda border. And that road was even built as a gift by the Americans who gave them for free. And the contractor who did that road did not do edgings at the side of the road. At the side of the road, you have to do edgings so that when the tide goes over, they just cut it like this. And so if you not careful, go to the edge, you fell on it. Cars were falling on their side. That is the only tide road that was in that country, 120 miles.
Did the Americans succeed in their goal then with sparking that civil war to get access to the oil reserves?
No, they haven't succeeded yet because Salva Kiir is still president. And was it 2 weeks ago, I found that they have again postponed the elections to 2026 or something. So he's still there. The Americans wanted him out, but the guy is still there.
I see. Interesting.
Yeah.
There's so much I don't know, which is good. This is why I'm doing this podcast, because there's so much I'm learning. This is a very knowledgeable episode, honestly. I feel like I could talk to you for many more hours and learn a whole lot more.
You've highlighted this earlier where you said that colonial masters made Africans lose their self-confidence. And one of the things that you were aiming to do is help Africans regain their self-confidence through positive narratives of Africa. And I guess there's a lot of people, Black Africans in the diaspora, who are potentially struggling or learning more about their identities, especially since the Black Lives Matter movement and lots of people talking about decolonizing knowledge, etc. So what do you think as people, individuals can do to kind of understand where this lack of self-confidence comes from and how they can regain that? Is it through the material that you have published? But are there any other words of wisdom to help our listeners?
I think what individuals we can do is to educate ourselves. History is very important to every human being. But Africans, we haven't taken time to learn our own history, the history of the world. It's not a very important subject, even in our university. We haven't taken time to learn history. And I have been pushing the idea, even in Zimbabwe, because now there is something called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That is what they want to teach us. And science, technology, engineering, mathematics, very good because we need them. But I'm saying, why don't you add H onto it and make history? Because history is as important as science. It's important like mathematics. If you don't know where you were yesterday, you not know where you are today, and you not know your future. When, what's his name? The name is escaping me, but his real name was Eric Atable, said, he who controls the past controls the future. And he who controls the future controls the present. It's very important that we learn history so that we'll be able to inform ourselves. That is the only way we can regain our self-confidence. And as individuals, when we have the information, then we can do activism. I'll set you one example. At the moment in Ghana, there is a major public outcry against illegal mining. There are small-scale miners who we call them galamsey, who have destroyed almost every water body in the country. And environmentally, we have a disaster. And people are now agitating against this. I'm seeing on the social media, everybody is now saying that the current government has been in power for 8 years. They have only 4 more months to go because we are having elections in December. So I'm saying, why are they now rising up and jumping about Galamsey now. What about the 8 years? What happened? Was it just for lack of information? Did people not know what was going on? Have they just known how much Galamsey has destroyed our country? All the rivers in the country now have turned brown. I did an article last week. I was comparing Ghana and Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, too, we have small-scale miners. But the government took an enlightened policy by first trying to train these small-scale miners, giving them funding and equipment, and then coming out with a law and said, you cannot mine in the bed of rivers or near rivers. So in Zimbabwe, their rivers, even though they are illegal miners, their rivers are clean, pristine. But in Ghana, every river there is now brown. Individually, I think we should try to get information, and when we should act on them. We shouldn't wait until 4 months when this president is going out.
How could we do something practical on the ground? When we have information such as this, what is a smart, clever way for us to act on it, for an individual person, a listener, to act on this and create some sort of movement or community?
If I should take the Ghana example, there are bloggers. There are people like you who have your podcast and bloggers and TV guys and radio guys. They will go underground and then use the social media as a way of whipping up public support. So that is what they have done in Ghana at the moment. They will go down with their cameras, shoot images, come and put on the social media or on their TV channels and talk about it on radio. So to get a groundswell of public opinion against that kind of evil. So I think through that, and then also uniting our fronts, like us in the media, we can close our ranks and support. If I have the story, then the other media house will pick it up, and then it will be rolling and rolling. And then you get public support from the ordinary people in the street who will also join in. And public opinion will be increasing, and then we can get some change.
So it's really reclaiming your identity through knowledge and education, and then actively trying to make a difference depending on what you do, amplifying the voices of other individuals in Africa. But I wanted to ask, the things you produce, the Third Eye or New Africa archives, are they accessible online?
Yes, for New African, all the things we did, I think it's online. I have the archive myself, so from time to time, I go back to look at it. The Third Eye, we are trying to make it look good. You can also access it online.
I'm thinking about the new generation and social media and knowledge in sort of bite size. And I think sometimes people want to read things or take out time, but they don't always get the chance. Yeah, exactly. So if there's something online that they can browse, even if it's on their commute to work or university or whatever it may be, because we can also obviously link it as part of this podcast, so more people can be aware of your work and your resistance.
Yes, unfortunately for the Third Eye, it's very heavy reading. We deliberately made this because we want people to either lie in bed and read it or lie in their couch, read it, and think about it. And I remember when we started, I did an editorial and said, the Third Eye is not for the faint-hearted. You need to have, say, weekend. I'm going to sit down and read. But I see that young ones want, like I said, bite-size kind of things. I don't know how we can get them.
Maybe somebody who has the time to invest and also has the creativity, they can take some of the knowledge from reading the Third Eye and kind of create accessible knowledge for other people.
Our articles are very detailed. Know how you could do that. And I never forgot here, Hamid, you mentioning the Africa Fat book, but we haven't talked about that. The Africa is also one of my babies, which I edited. And it is 1120 pages, 1,120 pages. No, almost 1,200 pages. And it's published by our organization called the Institute of African Knowledge, based in Harare. We wanted to come out with counter information to abuse, or not abuse, as a counter information to what the Western media, Western academia, Western historians have reported about Africa over time. So it is an encyclopedia that looks at Africa in its broad expanse.
Yeah,
History,
because I saw it. It starts from Algeria all the way.
yeah. So it has four parts. Section A deals with African history. Section B deals with contemporary Africa and facts about Africa. Then we have C that deals with African inventions, because there are people who say that black people can invent. So we look at black inventions in USA, Europe, and Africa. And then we have a very good section on the African diaspora, global Africa, from USA all the way to Japan and the Solomon Islands and those Pacific Islands.
It must have taken a long time to create this.
It took us about 2 years. And I nearly died out of that project because it was too much. The writers that we wanted to help did not come up. So it became a major thing for me. And personally, I don't want to do shoddy work. So I put myself into it, and it nearly killed me. Yes, nearly. Yeah.
But thank God you're still here.
Yeah.
Thank God
I'm
you're
still here. I'm still here. So
Thank God
that
you're
book is
still
still there for Africa.
Yes, that book is a great source of knowledge, and we are going to link it in the description below with our podcast. So the Africa Fact Books, as well as the Third Eye. Is the Third Eye available to purchase online as well? So we can link it in the description.
We're not actually selling online. I have to look into it, but we have a website.
Okay.
So
So if you
maybe
provide the website,
now
I'll
that
add it to the description.
yeah, we have to start selling online.
Yeah. Definitely, it should be something, because through the power of the internet, we can go global. And the whole purpose of this podcast is to try to find out how we can empower Africans globally and increase
Yeah.
the global respect for Black and African people everywhere. So I feel like things like this, we should be taking opportunity. We should be taking the opportunity of the internet and using that to really expand our reach. And based on everything you've told me today, Baffour, I feel like if I was to ask you what can we do to empower Africans globally, you can tell me if this is right or not. But I suspect you will say what we need to do is take control of our own stories in order to increase our self-confidence, because you've been talking about self-confidence a lot. So
Yes.
is that what you would say, or would you say something else with regards to how do we empower Africans?
I would say just that, and also how to empower African. Go into history. Let's study history. Let's study history. Very critical. I keep saying history is the only subject in the Bible that God said, study it. History. When they crossed the Red Sea, the Jewish people crossed the Red Sea, and when they went into the desert, God gave them manna to eat. And he told Moses, he said, take a jar of manna and put it there, put it in the ark of the covenant, so that in future, when your children ask you what happened, then you can show them. That is history. When they crossed the Jordan, at the time Moses had died, Joshua has taken command. When they crossed the Jordan, God parted the Jordan again, and he told Joshua, let 12 men go into the river, bring out 12 stones, set it up as a monument where you are going to stay tonight. Let it be a memorial, so that when your children in future ask you, you can point to that. That is history. Very cardinal. History is very important, but in Africa, the white man knows that history empowers you. So they just diverted us. Today, I sit here and I can tell my ancestry comes from ancient Egypt. And the ancient Egyptians were mighty empire builders. It gives me confidence to also do more so that I can beat my ancestors. But people don't know. We've been allowed, European historians, to tell us that Black people have done nothing to help the world here. We have no part in world civilization. But we know that our ancestors built ancient Egypt, from where we gave birth to even Israel, where now Netanyahu is doing all these things here. Without ancient Egypt, there will be no Israel. Remember, I don't know whether you know your Bible story.
I don't know the Bible stories like that.
There were only 70 of them who arrived. After 430 years, there were now about 5 million going out. They married into the native population that was black. So the Israelites left Egypt, half African. They have half African blood in them and half Jewish blood because they came with only 70. How did they increase to 5 million in 530 years? They married our women and men. These were black at the time. Ancient Egypt was purely a black empire. So they went away half African. Netanyahu's ancestors were half African, half Jewish.
Well, I feel like Netanyahu is just strictly white, based on what I know of him. Isn't he? Isn't he from Poland?
To say he's got Polish heritage.
He's basically European.
Yeah, but the point I'm making is that on the whole, went with African blood in them. So they will pass on. Yeah, Egypt, if you remember the conquest of ancient Egypt, all these nations came around. But at the time when the Europeans came, the Jews had already left.
Okay.
Yeah. When the Jews were in Egypt, no nation attacked it. All the attacks that came on ancient Egypt was when the Jews had left.
Look into this ancient Egypt stuff and just know just how ancient it was, because obviously now Egypt is filled with Arabs, people that look Arab at least, or people that look like they're Arabs. And obviously this isn't the first time I've heard that, the ancient version of Egypt had more black skinned, dark skinned individuals like ourselves. So it's going to be interesting to see, for me to look into it myself and just try to understand, because there's been more, this has been said many times and I just haven't paid attention. I guess mainly because to me, it hasn't really mattered as much, because I felt like even just the stuff that we did in West Africa, just the empires, that the Songhai Empire, the Hausa kingdoms, all the kingdoms that were built, what's it called? Ouagadougou, all these different empires, and Ghana itself were big enough, were impressive enough, but it's something I definitely need to look into. But yeah, awesome.
Do something on ancient Egypt. Study it. And it will blow your eyes. There's a book done by Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization or something. He did it for me.
Chancellor Williams, you said?
Yeah. The Destruction of Black Civilization, I think.
Okay.
Get a copy.
All right. I would definitely look into that.
Yes. It opened my eyes. Very good book.
All right. I think that is it. I think we're done for today's conversation. I wanted to say thank you so much for your time, Baffour. It was really eye-opening. I learned a lot, enlightening. Learned about Zimbabwe, learned about Charles Taylor and Liberia and a bunch of Ghana and different countries. And this is what this podcast is here for. So I want to say thank you for your time. Truly appreciate you. Thank you for coming on. Sumera, anything you want to say to Baffour?
There's a lot of knowledge here, and I just want the listeners to be able to access this knowledge. We don't have to start again. We just have to access the knowledge, and there's a lot out there. So thank you again for your time. It's been a privilege to be able to be here and learn more from you.
Thank you too for bringing me on. It's been a good evening for me to look back where I started and the things that I did. Sometimes you think you're the only one out, but seeing you young people taking up the baton is good for us. There's hope for our people.
Amazing.
Thank you.
It's the age of reason, African rising season, yam and dog skin season, enterprise.